Hi everyone. I just want to make a couple of comments on the end of Code's book Ecological Thinking here for this week, chapters 6 and 7. Don't want to really go through it in a huge amount of detail, but I think there are a couple of things worth bringing up, and then we can hear from presenters as well on this. And so, Code's book called Ecological Thinking, has been arguing all along in a certain sense that the way we think, by which she means the way we produce knowledge, so the epistemological questions, are done in a kind of larger context, I guess. In other words, they're not reductive sorts of things. We can't just look at knowledge as the sort of thing that, starts from a set of axioms or starts from a set of observations and then we deduce, or conclude something based on that. And so by this point in the book, she is really trying to give us some examples and think through the implications of what that actually means. And so in chapter 6, called Rational Imagining Responsible Knowing, she's really looking at the question of imagination. And I want to give a bit of background to why that matters, because I think it might not be entirely obvious. If you think about ethics in the modern period, and some of the people we looked at earlier in this course, Kant, Mill, kind of standard sort of ethicists. In the modern period, at least, you might get the idea that imagination really isn't part of ethics at all, right? I mean, you might get the idea that, in fact, the goal of ethics is to find a kind of set of principles by which we live, rules, if you wish, be able to justify those rules, and and then apply them to specific situations. And so that doesn't necessarily take a lot of imagination. And you can see that sometimes in the kind of, I guess you would say, consequentialist versions of ethics that we sometimes see, especially in politics and public policy, but other places as well. I mean, it was most obvious after 9/11 and the George W. Bush administration. At one point he famously came out and said, you're either with us or you're with the enemy or the terrorists, or I've forgotten which word he used. And so that very kind of bifurcated, with us or against us kind of logic, makes the moral questions very, very stark and very, very, there's not a lot of ambiguity to them. And I think sometimes we think that that's the kind of exemplar of the moral problem or the moral stance, right? They should be like that, and we recognize that they can't always be like that because we don't have enough knowledge. Some aspects are fuzzy, some values come in conflict, all of that. But that's what ethics ought to look like. And I think what Code is trying to do here when she's talking about moral imagination is push back against that. She's trying to basically say, no, that is a problematic view of ethics. And it's probably a problematic view of knowledge too, for that matter. But certainly when it comes to ethics, if we proceed from that kind of zero-sum sort of thing, right and wrong, you got to know which side you're on, all of those sorts of things, you can end up, really marginalizing some voices, misunderstanding a lot of voices, and failing to see that there are many times that, in fact, there are options one could take that reinforce values that are not your own. So in other words, it's not just my values or somebody else's values, and my values ought to win. So the idea of moral imagination, it's actually a term that's used both in conservative circles. Russell Kirk, I think, used it, someone like that, who's a kind of old-style conservative political thinker. But it's used a lot more, I think, in kind of versions of morality that take the groundedness of our moral decisions seriously, right? And so it's really the idea that a better moral choice, a better moral perspective is one which has drawn on imagination in order to understand people in positions other than itself, understand a range of options that may not be immediately obvious, and broaden the moral sphere, essentially. I've often been slightly amused that I'm actually teaching anything about ethics at all, because when I was in grad school, I kind of avoided it like the plague. And the reason I avoided it was that a lot of discussions about ethics were around those kinds of what I think of as limit cases. And so, a famous one is the trolley problem, right? So here's a trolley coming down a track, and, there's a branch that it could take. And on one branch, there's 5 people tied to the track. And on the other branch, there's one big person tied to the track, or one person that has some health condition or something like that. And then now you are told, decide. You are at the lever to push the train down one track or the other. Which one are you going to do? And so that sort of thing is presented as the kind of quintessential moral problem. The problem in which we have to act. We have to act now. There's a very delimited situation. And, when I hear problems like that, my first question is, how did we get in this situation in the first place? I mean, what was it about our systems that failed to the extent that now we're in this position? And those might be, literal, systems of the train, or they might be the systems that led people to be tied to this track. There might be any number of different things, but all of those things serve to kind of bracket out the social world and the social situation in which we find ourselves, in order to force you to make a decision on, what will you do? Flip the switch this way, flip the switch that way. And what kind of person are you based on that, decision? I think that is in some ways the least interesting, kind of problem within ethics. The more interesting problems within ethics are, how do we live within an ethical world, within an ethical situation, within a virtuous situation, such that those problems don't come up in the first place, right? So, we argue about kind of great social issues of the time, issues of abortion, issues of, poverty, and, all sorts of different things. And, many of these are really issues that need to be looked at in the longer term, and they're issues that involve both our sense of social institutions and what they do and what they don't do, and also our sense of knowledge, our sense of epistemology. Like, what do we claim to know? Do we claim to know things about what those people are like? Do we think that the poor are lazy, right? Do we think we know that? Well, we're wrong about that. But, if we hold that as a bit of knowledge, then that has implications for how we how our ethical, and social policy sorts itself out. And so, that's why it's so important for me to only do ethics within the space of the social institutions and the epistemology in which we find ourselves, okay? And, my own background is what is sometimes called Anabaptist. It's Mennonite. And one of the very famous positions of Mennonites is the peace position, pacifists, okay? And so what most people think of when they think of pacifism is, just not going to war, right? So you've been called to war, there's a threat, somebody's, attacking you, and here's this person says, no, I'm not going to do anything about it. And that feels like a reprehensible sort of, like, what, you're going to check out now just when we need you kind of thing. But of course, if you get into the, the writings of pacifists, not only within my own tradition, but others as well, you realize quickly that that's not what they're talking about, right? What they're talking about is, what does it mean to live in a world of peace? What does it mean to set the conditions for peace? What does it mean to deal with the social problems so that the situations of war don't even come up? What does it mean to live at peace all of the time, not just in that moment of decision? And so that's the real issue. That's what that whole position is actually about. And I think, Code is trying to argue for something like that. In the 6th chapter, she talks a lot about imagination, and she goes and talks about Mark Johnson's book, Moral Imagination, which is a good book, and she says as much. I think she says that, Johnson is doing something really important here. He's trying to say, look, we have to expand our sense of moral imagination so that more options are available. She criticizes him as well, right? I mean, she criticizes him as, if you actually look at the ranges that he wants to talk about for moral imagination, they're still pretty restricted. They're still pretty, white, Western male, hetero, all the rest of that, right? I mean, his imagination isn't exactly very broad. I suspect if you talk to him now, it would be a lot broader, right? I mean, that book was, I've forgotten when that book was written, but it was quite a while ago at this point. And so what Code is after is really imagination that really can take into account the experiences of people who don't write the textbooks, who don't lecture in universities, who don't, have the kind of levers of power, as it were. How do we get those experiences, and how do we actually take those experiences seriously? It doesn't mean that everything everyone says is fine, right? What it means is those experiences matter too, right? And they matter philosophically, not just as a kind of testimony on the part of some individual. There needs to be the ability to think conceptually about the experiences of the poor, about the experiences of women, about the experiences of Africans, about the experiences of all sorts of people who have not been part of the mainstream conversation. And so the real question is, how do we get to that point, right? I think personally philosophy has been slow to go there, but it is learning. It is learning, right? I mean, there are more and more people who recognize that that's a central question. Often when I talk about African philosophy, I try to make the distinction. I try to tell people, look, African philosophy is not a regional philosophy, right? And by regional philosophy, we might mean something which is, of interest only to people from that region. So if you're from Africa, or if you, have African heritage in some manner, yeah, maybe you're interested in African philosophy. But for everyone else, yeah, okay, that's what those folks over there do, but it doesn't really matter. And the analogy I usually want to use is actually to feminist philosophy, and feminist philosophy like codes, in fact, because what is going on there is not what you might think of as a particularism or as a regionalism. It's not that what Code is saying is of interest only to women. What she's saying is there is an experience on the part of women that that delivers a whole way of thinking that's not available by however you want to frame the mainstream or something like that. This matters. This matters. And this is a major contribution, a major critique and understanding of the mainstream. We are at the point now that, as far as I'm concerned, if you were just to take a straight-up ethics course, like not the course I'm doing, but a straight-up ethics course, you're not doing it right unless you're including feminist content, right? Because, care ethics and standpoint epistemology and, questions around, family and connection and all of those sorts of things. I mean, those don't easily come out of, the kind of classics and standards of Western ethics, but they are immensely important questions, and I think they've enriched the discussion of ethics. And so, you really have to have those, so that means that feminism is not regional in that sense of being of interest only to a subset of people. It is of interest to all of us. Same thing with African philosophy. I think it's of interest to all of us. It's a perspective that, should be people should be aware of, because it is, contributing the experience of the colonies and the post-colonies, of the history of slavery, of the history of the apartheid, of the history of, all sorts of things that the West has done to Africa, but then also things that Africa itself has done quite apart from Western incursions, right? So, the richness of its own history, questions of Ubuntu, kind of connection between people. I mean, all sorts of different things. So anyway, all of that is a kind of a gloss, I guess, or kind of thoughts based on this chapter about imagination. I think Code is right about this, and ethics is just much more significant and interesting if we're able to take that into account. The final chapter is actually an extended kind of case study, I guess you could call it, about Nancy Oliveri. And this was a case in Canada. I remember this case. I was there at the time. And it was 1998-ish and beyond that. And so Code's treatment of this, I think, is really, really important and interesting. I mean, she really kind of takes Canadian media to task for how it framed the issues. So, you've read this, I know, but, Oliveri is a scientist who was troubled by some tests that a pharmaceutical company were doing. She thought that they were not, that there were problems with them, and the pharmaceutical company did not want her to report this to the public. She did anyway. She lost her job. She was prosecuted. Lots of bad things happened, and it was reported, in the media. And you see some of the reports in this chapter. You see some of the images, which are really interesting, I think, in terms of thinking through how we frame ethical questions, right? And that's part of what Code is trying to do in this chapter. She's trying to say, look, these images actually were part of the argument to effectively diminish her, right? Effectively put her in the category of, the nurturing woman, or the hard as nails crusader, or the sexy woman, or the whatever. But if you imagined that this was a male who'd done exactly the same things that she had done, you would never see images like this. You would never, the questions would have been around policy, would have been around what this person had done, all of those sorts of things. But what we get instead, because it's her, is a certain way of kind of putting her in a box so that we can't really hear her voice. Okay. And Code wants to use this example, I think, as a kind of larger, a statement about how science has tended to marginalize women, and other areas as well, right? What she's trying to say is, look, it's not always about literally saying, "Oh, you're a woman, therefore, we're not going to take what you're saying seriously." It's almost always much more subtle than that. It's almost always mediated through images, mediated through the offhand remark, mediated through who gets invited to meetings and who doesn't. Mediate through any number of things, the kind of reactions that one might get to a paper, being presented at a meeting. How many rebuttals are there? How many, how fast do they come? Yeah, I mean, all sorts of different things. There have actually been studies about this. There was a recent one about, women in economics. And what they found was that they were getting a lot more pushback than men. Questions were coming in their papers in conferences much quicker. They were much more negative. They were much more demeaning. All of these sorts of things. And so these are all, they may feel subtle, but they don't feel subtle to the person presenting the paper, right? They don't feel subtle to the woman receiving these criticisms. And they can tell that there's a difference between how they're being treated and others, men are being treated. Similar things operate on racial questions. Racial categories. And so, what Code is trying to do, I think, in this chapter is just to point out the cost, well, the mechanisms first, but also the cost of, the policing of knowledge production. I think the Oliveri case is just a really great one, because we like to think of science as being a kind of purely rational enterprise where we simply follow conclusions. But nicely wrapped up in this one are not only, the treatment of women, but also capitalism, commerce. This is a pharmaceutical company. They want their product on the market. It's going to mean a lot of lost money if they can't get it there. And so, there are those questions going on as well. Public policy and government policy. Well, how do we treat whistleblowers? Those questions are there as well. And, just really even the benign questions. I mean, I'm reminded of, a scientist named Evelyn Fox Keller. And she talks about, she's a historian of science, really, and she looks at the early days of our knowledge about DNA. Okay, so we're talking 1950s, and so forth. And so we're starting to figure out that DNA is a double helix, and how genes work and all of that sort of thing. And she says at the time there were basically two models. There was what she calls the master molecule model and the steady state model. And the master molecule model was the model in which a gene has a particular effect or a particular expression, right? So, the most obvious one of that is for eye color, right? So there's a gene for eye color, and that's really easy to understand. We can find that. That's pretty straightforward. The fact is, we realize at this vantage point in history, that's actually the minority in terms of how genes actually operate. If that's what we're looking for in genes, we're not going to find many that do that. if that's what we're looking for, we might tend to think that there's this kind of hierarchical model. A gene is like a control mechanism, and it flips a switch, and then this, this outcome happens, this expression happens in proteins, and then in, physical characteristics. The steady state model is the model that says it's always about a bunch of genes working together with a bunch of other stuff, right? I mean, early on in genetic research, we used to think that there's lots of junk DNA in our bodies, DNA that doesn't have that quality of flipping a switch. Well, now we look at that junk DNA and realize, no, maybe it's not junk. Maybe we need an entire environment for these for genes to operate. Maybe the stuff that didn't actually come from us but came from viruses and bacteria and all of that is necessary for being who we are. Maybe we're so integrated with the rest of the world, with our environment, that we can't actually even tell what is purely human and what is not human, because it is wrapped down to our genetic code level, okay? And so that's a very different model, right? I mean, that's a model in which now we have to understand dynamic networks. We have to understand what we might think of as autopoiesis. So in other words, the ways in which unexpected effects are created from the interaction of particular elements. A lot of stuff that gets a lot more complicated, but a lot more informative and accurate, I think, than that kind of move to simplify, right? So I think code here is trying to resist that move to simplify and arguing that the way to resist it is to take women's knowledge seriously. It's to take, non-Western knowledge seriously. It's to take all of these things seriously, and none of that means we just, have, a kind of big group hug and say, well, everything is as good as everything else, right? It means that we take seriously the idea that there is knowledge that can then be investigated. That we take seriously the idea that women's experience is really happening and that it matters. That we take seriously all of those sorts of much richer ways of thinking about the world. That's why this is ecological thinking, right? Thinking about an ecology, an ecological system, is always about thinking about the system, not about just a single element of the system, a single animal within the system. So that's what I think code's takeaway is. I think it transforms our view of how ethics can work and should work. It transforms it from that kind of fairly simplified idea that all we need is a set of rules that will, enable us to apply things to the real world, and realize that all of our ethical behavior is always a negotiation on the ground. It's always about listening. It's always about understanding. And no, that doesn't mean that we can't make policy at all. No, that doesn't mean that we're just kind of mired in the mundane and can't make general principles or rules of things. It means that we have to look at a lot more than maybe people are comfortable with looking at sometimes. So that is what I see going on at the end of Code's book here, and so I'm interested to see what presenters have to say and what all of you have to say in the discussion area. So I'll see you soon.